On a quiet stretch of New York's coastline sits an island almost no one is allowed to visit. Its hospital has been abandoned for decades. Yet the city still pays to keep guards on watch around the clock. Not to protect the buildings, but to protect something inside them. New York is famous for its landmarks: Times Square, the Statue of Liberty, Central Park. But few people realize that scattered around the city are islands with stories far stranger than anything found in the tourist brochures. Islands that held secrets, tragedies, and experiments the public was never meant to witness. But among all of them, one hospital stands out. A place built to protect the city by separating it from the people brought here. A place where fear shaped policy, where science struggled against the unknown, and where thousands of lives passed quietly into the records of history. Today, its halls are silent, its windows shattered, its rooms untouched since the day the staff walked away. And yet, guards remain. To understand why, we have to step back. Long before the hospital was built, long before the first patient arrived, back to when the island itself was still a nameless piece of land floating offshore, waiting for its dark purpose to unfold. When Europeans first arrived in the region, the island was little more than a rocky outcrop, too small for farming, too isolated for settlement. Local tribes knew of it, but rarely used it. To them, it was a place of stillness, quiet, cut off, uninhabitable. But as the colonies grew, so did New York's problems. Crowded streets, rushing ships, rising illness. The harbor became the beating heart of trade, and also the gateway through which diseases arrived. The city needed somewhere out of sight, somewhere out of mind, somewhere to put the things no one wanted near the mainland. In the 18th and early 19th centuries, disease spread through cities with devastating speed. Cholera, smallpox, yellow fever, names that once shook entire communities. With limited medicine and no public health infrastructure, authorities turned to isolation. Ships suspected of carrying illness were held offshore. Passengers were kept aboard for days or weeks, and as outbreaks increased, the city looked for land, just enough to separate danger from a living. The island soon became a quarantine point. Not officially, not yet, but quietly, unrecorded. People with strange symptoms were brought here to keep them away from crowded neighborhoods. A temporary fix that became a lasting habit. New Yorkers lived with a constant fear of the unseen. A single outbreak could empty streets and shutter businesses. Newspapers printed warnings and speculation. Rumors spread faster than the diseases themselves. Whenever illness appeared, someone would point toward the island. "That's where they take the sick," people whispered. "Don't go near it." No official building had been constructed, no hospital staff assigned, and yet the island's reputation began shaping itself, one whispered story at a time. By the mid-1800s, the city was drowning in new arrivals. Immigration surged. Ships anchored daily. People came seeking opportunity, but many arrived weakened, malnourished, or carrying illnesses contracted during long sea voyages. The city could no longer rely on makeshift quarantine. Officials needed a permanent solution, a place far enough to isolate, but close enough to manage. And so the island's fate was sealed. The decision was made quietly, without fanfare. Documents were drafted, budgets allocated. The island would become the city's first line of defense. Locals didn't protest the decision. Most barely noticed it. But those who did had questions. Why this island? Why out here, away from public view? Why so quietly? Some believed the city wanted to hide realities that made the public uncomfortable. Others said officials feared panic if people knew how many were being brought here. Whatever the truth, the island was no longer ignored. It was becoming something else, a place with a purpose few would ever fully understand. Construction started in the late 1800s. It wasn't a large hospital at first, just enough rooms to treat patients and keep them away from the mainland. The building materials were shipped in by boat. Workers lived nearby, traveling to the island each morning. Architect designed the facility with one goal: containment. Thick walls, narrow hallways, multiple layers of entry, ventilation that moved air in only one direction, away from the city. The hospital's early staff consisted of volunteers and newly trained medical workers. Many were young, idealistic, willing to take risks. Most people avoided. They worked long hours, slept in cramped quarters, and faced illnesses without effective medicine. Some stayed out of duty, others because they felt they were part of something historic. But even they couldn't have predicted what a hospital would eventually become. Everything the hospital needed, food, medicine, clothing, had to be delivered by boat. When storms hit, shipments stalled. Staff rationed supplies. Some patients went days without fresh linens or new clothes. The isolation wasn't only geographic. It was emotional. Weeks could pass without staff setting foot in the city. Patients who arrived rarely left. The hospital admitted its first patients quietly. No newspapers reported it. No public ceremonies marked the event. They were brought in under cover of early morning traffic, ferried across waters still dark from night. Many were immigrants, exhausted from travel. Others were long-time residents struck by sudden illness. All were isolated the moment they arrived. For most, the hospital offered a chance at recovery. For others, it became the last place they would ever see. As the population grew, so did the facility. New wings were added, more beds installed, laboratories built. The island became a medical complex, one that the city depended on more than it wanted to admit. Funding increased, then decreased, then surged again as new outbreaks emerged. Political pressure shaped decisions. The hospital grew not because the city planned it meticulously, but because it had no choice. By the turn of the century, the hospital wasn't just a building. It was a community. Staff dormitories, dining rooms, storage facilities, a morgue, laboratories, gardens for growing limited food. The island was alive, busy, constant movement. Yet it remained unseen by millions living just across the water. And that invisibility made it the perfect place to send those the city didn't know how to deal with. New York's leaders understood something unspoken. Fear moves faster than policy. Each new outbreak brought a wave of public panic. Newspapers sold more copies. Politicians gave urgent speeches. And the island's hospital became the city's reassurance, a place to send the sick, the contagious, the unknown. It didn't matter that medicine was still limited. What mattered was distance, keeping illness far enough away for people to feel safe. And so with each crisis, the hospital expanded its reach. By the early 1900s, the island had become a place locals whispered about. Children dared each other to point at it from a ferry. Adults avoided the topic altogether. Its reputation wasn't helped by the city's silence. No tours, no public reports, no visiting hours, just rumors. The hospital's work was necessary, but quiet, hidden by water, distance, and policy. As medicine advanced, the hospital expanded its laboratories. Researchers worked long hours, studying bacteria, viruses, and unexplained symptoms. Their goal was simple: understand what frightened the public. The labs weren't secret, but they weren't advertised either. Visitors weren't allowed. Samples arrived by boat in sealed containers. The work was delicate, and the consequences of error were unthinkable. This added another layer to the island's mythology. Not just patients, but experiments. Originally built for containment, the hospital gradually became something more complex. It was no longer just a place of quarantine. It was a place for people society didn't know how to care for. People who needed long-term treatment. People who had nowhere else to go. Some stayed for weeks, some for years. And the longer people remained, the more the island took on the appearance of a small, isolated town, with stories, conflicts, and tragedies all its own. At its height, the hospital island housed hundreds of people. Staff, patients, maintenance workers, cooks, cleaners, researchers. Boats arrived daily. Supplies were unloaded in long chains of crates and barrels. Generators hummed. Kitchens prepared hundreds of meals. Lanterns illuminated the halls at night. The island was busier than some neighborhoods on the mainland. Yet photographs are scarce. The city rarely documented the daily life here. Isolation shaped everyone on the island. For staff, it meant long stretches away from families. Letters became lifelines. Newspapers arrived days late. Weather often trapped them on the island longer than expected. For patients, isolation created an invisible barrier between them and the world they once knew. Many recovered, but were required to remain until doctors believed they posed no risk. The island felt both like a hospital and a boundary. Life on the island followed a strict rhythm. Morning rounds, preparation of meals, lab work, evening checks, disinfection procedures, record keeping. Some staff members formed friendships that lasted decades. Others struggled with the emotional weight of their work. And always there were the sounds. Footsteps on wooden floors, the clang of metal trays, the soft hum of equipment. A soundscape now silent. As the 20th century progressed, medicine changed rapidly. New treatments, vaccines, and diagnostic tools emerged. Some of these advancements were tested, refined, or implemented first on islands like this. Doctors here were often the first to witness how new methods worked in real conditions. Their observations shaped policy across the city. Over the decades, records mention incidents on the island. None dramatic, but enough to raise questions. Power outages, storm damage, a few unexplained evacuations. Details are scarce. Some records were lost. Others were never written. But every event added to the hospital's reputation as a place touched by the unknown. Working on the island wasn't like working in the city. Some staff members described it as transformative. The isolation, the quiet, the responsibility, the sense that the world just beyond the shoreline didn't fully understand what happened here. Over time, many staff members developed a deep connection to the island. Others couldn't wait to leave. By the mid-20th century, the world outside the island was changing rapidly. Cities grew, medical science advanced, and new public health strategies emerged. Hospitals were no longer isolated fortresses. Modern treatment moved closer to the communities that needed it. But the island hospital held on. Its walls stayed upright. Its routines continued. Its isolation remained. And slowly, the first cracks appeared. New treatment methods meant fewer long-term patients. Vaccines rendered several diseases manageable. Urban hospitals became safer, better funded, and better equipped. The idea of isolating the sick on remote islands began to feel outdated. And yet, the island hospital did not close its doors. Its purpose shifted, but its secrecy remained. In the 1960s and 70s, the hospital's buildings aged faster than the budgets supporting them. Roofs leaked, floors warped, equipment stayed long past its intended lifespan. Staff members filed reports asking for repairs. Inspectors noted structural weaknesses. Yet upgrades came slowly, if at all. It wasn't neglect, it was something else. A feeling that the island's role in public health was being quietly phased out. As funding declined, so did staffing. Long-time workers retired or transferred to mainland hospitals. New hires were rare. Entire wings of the hospital grew quiet. Beds were removed. Doors were locked. Corridors went dark. By the 1980s, the island resembled a place caught between life and abandonment. The final decades brought smaller groups of patients, people receiving long-term care for conditions that required isolation, or individuals with nowhere else to go. Many lived quietly, forming bonds with the dwindling staff. Some patients stayed until the very end of the hospital's life. Their stories are preserved only in fragments, letters, notes, interviews. Nothing sensational, just lives spent on the edge of a city that rarely knew they existed. By the early 1990s, the city ordered a comprehensive review of the hospital. Engineers, inspectors, and planners visited the island over several months. Their conclusion was straightforward. The buildings could be repaired, but at a cost far greater than constructing new facilities on the mainland. And so, the island hospital received its final designation, a phase-out plan. There was no dramatic announcement, no televised press event. The hospital didn't close overnight. Instead, it faded out. Patient numbers dropped until only a handful remained. Staff transferred away. Departments shut down one by one. The island grew quieter with each passing year. The official closure took place on a calm morning. The last staff members walked through the halls, shutting off lights, locking cabinets, and securing rooms. One final boat carried them back to the mainland. And just like that, the hospital's long chapter ended. When the island was left unoccupied, it didn't fall silent. Its buildings remained. Its equipment remained. Its past remained. Wind pushed through broken windows. Birdsong echoed where footsteps once sounded. The island began its slow shift from hospital relic. Most abandoned hospitals in America follow a predictable pattern. They deteriorate, then either collapse or are demolished. Some become tourist sites or filming locations. But this island didn't follow that pattern. Instead, after the hospital closed, a new detail emerged, one that confused residents and drew the attention of historians. Security. For more than 2 decades after closure, the island remained under watch. Patrols made regular rounds. Boats monitored the shoreline. Officially, this was for safety, to prevent trespassing, vandalism, or accidents in unstable buildings. But many city properties are dangerous. Few receive this level of attention. Public officials offered straightforward explanations. The island was hazardous. Old labs contained materials that needed monitoring. Some structures were too unstable for visitors. These reasons were practical and sensible. Yet many records were missing. Inspections were restricted, and requests for access were often denied without explanation. Public officials offered straightforward explanations. The island was hazardous. Old labs contained materials that needed monitoring. Some structures were too unstable for visitors. These reasons were practical and sensible. Yet many records were missing. Inspections were restricted, and requests for access were often denied without explanation. Across the United States, a handful of old medical sites remain off limits decades after closure. Some stored infectious materials. Others handled research that required careful cleanup. The island's continued security fits within this history, but it doesn't answer every question. Communities near the island revived older stories, tales passed down for generations. They spoke of restricted wings, sealed rooms, unusual deliveries late at night. Much of this was speculation, none of it proven, but rumors grow easily in places where official information is scarce. In recent years, urban explorers have attempted to reach the island. Most were stopped before they arrived. The few who made it close enough to photograph the shoreline noticed updated cameras, repaired fencing, and active patrol schedules. Not all abandoned places receive this level of attention. Despite the mystery, the most logical explanation is also the most straightforward. The hospital's labs, records, and storage areas may still contain materials requiring oversight. Not dangerous, necessarily, just the type that demands proper management. That, in other words, the island is guarded not because of what it is now, but because of what it once was. Every abandoned site carries a trail of paperwork, permits, inspection reports, internal memos, faded letters. Kings Park was no different. But buried inside the state archives in a box mislabeled General Correspondence, 1960 to 1963, researchers uncovered something that didn't fit any category at all. A set of files that referenced no department and were signed by no one. One document, typewritten on yellowing paper, contained only a single sentence. Ward 23 must remain sealed. No explanation, no signature. The date stamped at the top was March 18, 1961, nearly 30 years before the hospital finally shut its doors. And yet no official floor plans ever listed a Ward 23. Not in the public versions, not in the architectural blueprints, not in the municipal records. It was a ghost wing, something that shouldn't exist. In 2007, a former maintenance worker agreed to speak anonymously. He claimed that long before the hospital closed, there was a corridor, bricked off, painted over, erased. Workers were told to stay away from it, not for safety reasons, but because it was not part of your responsibility. He recalled seeing numbers painted faintly on the wall, a 2, a 3, and a directional arrow, almost completely scrubbed away. When asked what he believed the area was used for, he refused to answer. He simply said, that part of the building wasn't meant for patients. Between 1958 and 1974, Kings Park hosted a series of inspections that were not conducted by the State Department of Mental Hygiene, at least not publicly. A set of men visited the hospital 6 times, each time marking their arrival in a ledger simply as federal representatives. No agency listed, no signatures, no forms filed. Their visits lasted hours, and they were always escorted by hospital security, never by medical staff. What's more alarming is this. Every log entry for those dates ends with the same phrase in red ink. Access granted to restricted substructure. Substructure, not basement, not storage. Substructure. It's a word used only in engineering and military documentation. On January 6, 1965, the hospital went completely dark for 7 minutes. Not a flicker. A full outage. Something that had never happened before. Nurses reported that patients grew strangely quiet during those minutes, despite the sudden blackout. No shouting. No panic. Just silence. When the power returned, staff members noticed a strange metallic smell in the air, something like burned wiring, but sharper. And in one of the far wings, several patients were found standing outside their rooms, staring toward the shut-down elevators. Records described the event as a routine electrical failure. But electricians later testified that no team was ever dispatched to fix anything that night. 2 days after the blackout, hospital guards logged an arrival. Unmarked van 2:14 a.m. Access granted to East loading platform. That platform wasn't used for deliveries. It led directly to the underground service tunnels. The same tunnels that maintenance staff were told not to enter without authorization. No departure time was ever recorded. Neighbors living near the hospital recalled seeing a convoy of security vehicles that night, their headlights off, their engines idling for nearly an hour. To this day, no one knows what was removed or brought in. In the late 1960s, the patient census lists at Kings Park show a number of abrupt departures. The problem is there are no transfer files, no release papers, no death certificates. 13 names simply stop appearing between March and July of 1969. When researchers tried to trace the individuals through Social Security records, they found nothing. Not a single match. Not a single continuation of identity. Some believe clerical mistakes caused the inconsistencies. Others believe these patients were moved into the restricted sections below the hospital, areas that have never been mapped publicly. When the hospital closed in 1996, most of the buildings were emptied within weeks. But Building 93, the most infamous structure on the property, remained locked long after everything else had been stripped. Even today, decades later, this building still shows signs of routine checks. Footprints in dust, replaced padlocks, new warning signs. Despite the building having no electricity, neighbors swear they've seen lights flicker behind the boarded windows on foggy nights. When Suffolk County Security was asked about it in 2018, they declined to comment. To this day, Building 93 is the only structure at Kings Park that retains continuous, around-the-clock monitoring. A property that's been empty for nearly 30 years shouldn't need guards. It shouldn't need new locks. It shouldn't need restricted zones or motion sensors or unmarked patrol routes. Yet Kings Park has all of these. Security personnel claim is to keep trespassers out. But if that were true, why are some areas more protected than others? Why do certain entry points have reinforced steel plates instead of simple plywood boards? Why do patrol vehicles arrive only at night? One reason stands above them all. Something inside those tunnels, those wards, those sealed wings is not meant for the public. Every institution built in the late 19th and early 20th centuries relied on tunnels. Steam lines, water mains, maintenance corridors, and service routes that allowed workers to move supplies without disturbing the wards above. Kings Park was no exception. But the tunnels beneath Kings Park weren't ordinary. They were wider, deeper, and more fortified than typical utility passages. Some even had reinforced ceilings, uncommon for maintenance routes of the time. Workers later recalled that certain sections were kept locked year-round. Even they didn't age. Ave keys. During the 1980s, a group of engineering students studying abandoned New York facilities came across a contradiction. The official blueprints for Kings Park showed only 2 major tunnel networks, but aerial thermal scans from the late 1960s, taken by the state, revealed heat signatures in areas where no tunnels should have existed. The temperature readings suggested not only activity, but heavy machinery, boilers or generators, operating long after the hospital had downsized. Those scans were never released publicly. Copies surfaced through a retired contractor decades later. In 1999, 3 years after the hospital closed, local explorers found a sealed hatch behind a collapsed loading dock behind Building 93. It was circular, metallic, and bolted shut with industrial-grade rivets. Nothing about it matched the age of the surrounding structure. When they returned the following week, the hatch was gone. Not open, gone. The concrete was smooth, patched, and painted over as if the entrance had never existed. That same month, the park rangers reported increased patrols and new restricted area signs. In 2004, 2 investigators with sound equipment conducted an acoustic test near the old laundry building. They expected silence. Instead, they picked up a low, rhythmic hum beneath the ground. The pattern didn't match pipes, boilers, or wind resonance. It pulsed, steady, controlled, mechanical. When they returned weeks later, the hum had stopped. But the ground near one of the sealed tunnel entrances was noticeably warm, despite the winter temperatures. Throughout the 1930s and 40s, Kings Park expanded constantly. New wards, new power plants, new housing for staff. But when historians compared expansion records with structural diagrams, they noticed several inconsistencies. Entire corridors appeared in early maps, but vanished from later editions. Not replaced, not repurposed, erased. Some of the missing sections were located directly beneath isolation wards. Others connected to the power plant. And a few sat directly below the wings that were locked decades before closure. One of the final night shift employees at Kings Park, a man who declined to reveal his identity, described something unusual during the last months before closure. He recalled hearing metallic clanking from below, long after the sub-basement was supposedly cleared. Security refused to investigate. They simply told staff to stay on their assigned floors and ignore noises coming from beneath the service level. When he asked who was working in the tunnels after midnight, the supervisor replied, "Those teams don't report to us." During structural inspections in 2013, surveyors discovered a staircase in Building 7 that descended into a concrete wall. At first glance, it looked like a simple renovation, a stairwell sealed due to safety issues. But the concrete blocking the stairs didn't match the age of the building. It was newer, poured decades after the stairwell was built. The older foundation behind it? Never found. Kings Park State Hospital closed in 1996. Its boilers were shut down. Its systems drained. Yet several explorers in the early 2000s described warm air blowing from vents in the lower buildings. Some theorized that it was leftover heat trapped in the earth. But the temperatures were too high, too consistent, too controlled, like a system still operating somewhere below. No records list any active equipment past the closure date. In 1977, a portion of the tunnel system collapsed. The official explanation cited soil erosion, but workers who were present that day described something different. According to them, the collapse wasn't sudden. It was triggered, like something underneath had shifted or been removed. They also mentioned an unusual smell escaping the debris. Chemical, harsh, unfamiliar. With the hospital long abandoned, there should be no reason for the tunnels to remain sealed, patrolled, and reinforced, unless the state is protecting something far older than the hospital itself, something stored beneath those wards, something hidden long before the property became public land. The tunnels aren't just part of the past. They are the key to why security still returns, why Building 93 remains locked, why access is denied even to researchers. They hold the part of Kings Park's history that was never meant to see daylight. By the early 20th century, psychiatric hospitals across the United States served more than medical needs. They became places where the state carried out work too delicate or too controversial for public oversight. Kings Park was no exception. While many wards focused on genuine patient care, others were used for research programs that the public knew little about. Programs involving behavior studies, environmental stress tests, and long-term observation of conditions that doctors barely understood at the time. These were not secret out of malice, but secrecy allowed them to operate without interference. And over the decades, that secrecy became part of the institution's identity. Kings Park once listed a specific wing dedicated to advanced observation. Early maps show it clearly, Building 21, marked with restricted access. But in the 1950s, the wing disappears from updated documents, not renamed, not repurposed, erased. When historians asked about it, agencies insisted the building never existed. Yet its foundation can still be traced in old construction plans. One of the most circulated testimonies from former staff describes a windowless room deep within the research wing, a room lined with thick walls, stronger than typical hospital construction. Its purpose is still disputed. Some believe it was a sensory reduction chamber, a technique used in mid-century psychology. Others describe it as a secure environment for controlled environmental studies. No record confirms either explanation. And in the late 1940s and early 50s, Kings Park ordered materials unusual for a hospital: industrial air filtration systems, pressure-sealed doors, and reinforced flooring. The shipments were delivered late at night by trucks with no agency markings. The invoices listed them under non-medical categories, such as infrastructure reinforcement. When former maintenance workers asked why a psychiatric ward needed such equipment, they were told, focus on installation, not purpose. A set of declassified notes from the 1960s reference an environmental chamber located below the main facility. The document describes it as an area for testing responses to controlled conditions, temperature, light exposure, and long-term isolation. Chambers like this were used across the country at the time to study stress tolerance and psychological resilience. But what made the Kings Park chamber notable was its depth. The notes mentioned 3 sublevels, far below what appears on public building plans. Around 1964, Kings Park staff began signing new confidentiality agreements. These were far stricter than earlier forms. Some restricted workers from discussing their duties for the rest of their lives. The agreements reference a project identified only by an acronym, one that appears nowhere else in state archives. What the project tested, what it measured, or whom it involved remains unclear. But every testimony lines up on one point. The project required absolute silence. By the mid-1960s, the Cold War influenced nearly every scientific institution in America. Research unrelated to defense suddenly received federal attention, including psychiatric studies. Kings Park saw new funding, new personnel, and new equipment, all of it routed through federal agencies rather than state channels. This period aligns with the tightening of restrictions around the hospital's eastern buildings, the same areas later sealed, fenced, and patrolled long after closure. One winter evening in the late 1970s, the staff of Building 93's lower wards were told to evacuate immediately. They were given no explanation. Doors were locked behind them. Access badges stopped working. A supervisor stated only that the area was no longer in service. But lights remained on. Equipment continued to hum. Supplies were delivered for weeks afterward. Whatever occurred in that wing never appeared in public logs. Several former workers described a corridor kept at unusually low temperatures, far below normal hospital settings. Some believed it housed sample storage. Others thought it was part of environmental testing. But when the hospital shut down, the refrigeration units remained active longer than any other system. Even after most of the facility went dark, that corridor still drew power. No official record explains why. Hospitals normally maintain detailed logbooks, patient movement, staff rotations, equipment checks, research schedules. Kings Park kept them until the 1980s. During a building inventory in 2001, an archivist noticed a gap of nearly 20 years in several departments. Entire decades of records gone. What replaced them were blank tabs, empty shelves, boxes containing only secondary forms. If Kings Park was simply a psychiatric hospital, why were sections reinforced like bunkers? Why did its tunnels reach deeper than necessary? Why were research wings erased from maps? And why, decades after its closure, Does security still monitor the grounds? To answer those questions, we have to examine what happened when the research programs ended, and why the shutdown was anything but ordinary. There are places on this island that even today no one enters. Not historians, not journalists, not urban explorers. Only one group has the keys, and they hardly use them. These are the sealed quarantine wards, the ones left exactly as they were during the hospital's final operational years. The doors were locked, the lights were turned off, and the buildings were simply abandoned, as if someone expected to come back the next morning. But no one ever did. Inside these structures, the air hasn't moved in decades. Furniture still sits where nurses left it. Medical trays remain lined up in tight rows. Hallways stretch into darkness with signs warning staff never to cross during active containment procedures. Historians who have reviewed interior photos say the same thing. It looks frozen, not destroyed, not decayed, just stopped. One of the most unsettling details? All windows facing Manhattan were painted over from the inside. Not boarded, not draped, painted. It wasn't meant to keep outsiders from looking in. It was meant to keep the patients from looking out. These buildings housed some of the most isolated individuals in New York's medical history. People whose conditions were so poorly understood that the only answer was to cut them off from the world. Even today, investigators report that certain documents inside remain classified. The folders are sealed, the cabinets are locked, and when requests are filed for public release, the answer is always identical. Denied. Reason: public safety. But what could possibly be unsafe decades after the hospital closed? That question leads to the next section, the one that shapes nearly every conspiracy surrounding the island. If you ask former staff about the missing files, some claim they never existed. Others insist they were taken away during the hospital's final week. No two stories match, but all of them point in the same direction. Something was documented here and later removed. The first reference to these lost files surfaced through an unnamed technician who worked in the pathology department. According to his account, shortly before the hospital closed, officials from the city arrived in unmarked vehicles. They went straight for the records room. The technician said the men knew exactly where they were going. No introductions, no questions, no hesitation. They loaded several boxes into vehicles and left without speaking to any staff. The technician wasn't told what was inside, but he remembered one thing clearly. The labels on the boxes didn't match anything used in the hospital. These weren't medical folders. They weren't patient charts. They were something else. To this day, those boxes have never been found in city archives, state archives, or health department records. Some believe the files documented a series of experimental treatments, procedures tested only when no other options existed. Others think they contained notes on how the hospital managed an outbreak that was never disclosed to the public. There's even a smaller theory, one usually dismissed but never disproven, that the files recorded how many people actually died on the island. The official numbers have always been estimates. No exact registry was ever released. And when a government refuses to release numbers, people ask why. Every abandoned place has stories. But here, the stories rarely come from the people you'd expect. Former nurses avoid interviews. Former administrators decline comment. And former security employees, the few who remain, either say nothing or say too much. The most revealing testimony comes from low-level workers, janitors, delivery drivers, and maintenance staff. People who didn't have authority, but had access. One janitor recalled being asked to clean a wing that should have been closed. When he opened the door, he found medical equipment scattered across the floor, papers half-burned in metal bins, and a smell he described only as chemical. He locked the door behind him and never returned. A former ferry operator told a local historian that some nights, additional passengers boarded without names on the manifest. They rode to the island, stayed briefly, then left under escort. He asked who they were. He was told not to. Another worker described hearing voices in a supposedly empty section. Not yelling, not suffering, but calm, low conversations. Except no one was assigned to those rooms. Then there are the testimonies that were suddenly withdrawn. One by one, early whistleblowers stopped speaking publicly. Some deleted statements from online forums. Others refused to answer follow-up emails. When reporters attempted to track them down, they found something strange. None of the retracted comments were followed by explanations. Just silence. And silence almost always means pressure. But the most haunting account? It came from someone who never worked at the hospital, but lived close enough to hear the island at night. She said that on certain evenings, just after midnight, she would hear what sounded like a siren echoing across the water. Not a fire truck, not an ambulance. A steady wail, rising and falling. The kind used historically when contaminati on zones are breached. Officially, the hospital never used such a siren. Unofficially, no one can prove it. There's one rumor that rises above every other theory, whispered by former workers, hinted at in old budget reports, and supported by unusual emergency meetings held during the hospital's final year. Many believe the island faced an outbreak that the public was never told about. Not an epidemic, not a catastrophe, but something smaller, stranger, and contained. A cluster of unexplained symptoms that didn't match known diseases. A series of patients who deteriorated quickly, without clear cause. The hospital's spending records reveal a spike in protective equipment purchases during a 6-week window. Masks, gloves, disinfectants, sealed containers. All ordered in large quantities. Yet no official report from that year mentions a corresponding event. And then there's the ferry restriction. For several days, movement to and from the island was reduced. Staff schedules were altered. Deliveries were consolidated. The explanation given at the time was resource management. But not a single staff member from that period remembers resource shortages. Then, suddenly, the records go quiet. No logs, no memos, no follow-up documentation. And it's as if someone took a pen, drew a line through the entire situation, and said, "This never happened." But incidents like that never simply disappear. Years later, 2 independent historians attempted to cross-reference the hospital's patient death records from that same period. They discovered several anomalies, cases labeled only as complications. No symptoms listed, no treatments listed, just the word complicati. ONS. To some, it's a clerical oversight. To others, a deliberate erasure. Whatever happened during those weeks, the island told no one, and in the silence theories grew. When the hospital finally closed, the city had a choice. Seal the gates, cut the power, and let nature take over. But they didn't. Instead, they posted guards. Decade after decade, long after the last patient left, security remained stationed on the island. Patrols in rotating shifts, lights maintained in key areas, alarms kept functional. No other abandoned hospital in New York received this level of protection. Officially, the explanation is simple: public safety. But guards have admitted off the record that their training included unusual protocols. They were told to avoid certain rooms, to never enter specific wings alone, to check for unauthorized movement, even when the buildings had no electricity and no occupants. Some former guards describe hearing footsteps on the upper floors. Others mention seeing lights flicker in structures without power. All of them agree on one rule, repeated during orientation. If something looks off, you report it. If something sounds off, you report it. And if something feels off, you leave. The question is, why maintain surveillance on buildings that are supposedly empty? There are only 2 possibilities. Either the island guards something valuable, or the guards themselves are being protected from something inside. Neither answer offers comfort. Every abandoned hospital leaves objects behind. But this island left artifacts. Pieces of lives interrupted abruptly, frozen in place. Inside some rooms, the shelves still hold journals written by patients whose names were never documented publicly. Their handwriting reveals fear, isolation, and confusion about treatments they didn't understand. In one of the sealed wings, investigators found small metal tags, each stamped with a number, not a name. These were once tied to personal belongings when patients entered quarantine. Many of the items were never returned. Operating rooms contained surgical tools from techniques no longer taught. Wards contained beds positioned deliberately apart, farther than standard spacing, even for the era. Storage closets contained containers designed to hold biological samples. though every one of them has been emptied. One room, untouched except for dust, holds a medical chart with a final note scrawled across the page. Condition advancing faster than expected. No name, no diagnosis, just the warning. These abandoned items tell a story the official documents refuse to reveal. A story about a hospital that wasn't just a hospital, but a last resort, a place used only when every other option failed. When the hospital closed, the official statement claimed the process was orderly and controlled. Records list the final day as calm, routine, and without incident. But eyewitness accounts paint a different picture entirely. Former maintenance staff described an emergency meeting late in the afternoon. Staff were told the hospital would cease operations immediately, not in a week, in a month. That day, patients were relocated under escort. Some were moved onto ferries, others into vehicles. Several rooms remained locked, and their occupants were never seen leaving. Workers remember alarms sounding, not fire alarms, not evacuation alarms, but a steady tone used during internal emergencies. Lights in certain buildings were shut off. Equipment was carried out rapidly. And somewhere between dusk and nightfall, something was burned behind the main laboratory. According to 2 independent testimonies, no one was allowed to approach. When morning came, the hospital was empty. But rumors say the island wasn't. That night left behind more questions than answers. And the city released none of them. It marked the end of a long, secretive chapter and the beginning of endless speculation. Every abandoned place grows legends. But this island grows theories supported by silence, missing records, and government oversight that continues to this day. Theory 1. The island housed an undisclosed medical crisis, one that officials wanted to contain quietly. Theory 2. Experimental treatments were tested here before public hospitals ever tried them, and the records were destroyed to prevent public backlash. Theory 3. The hospital handled a series of unusual medical cases, so rare that the files were sealed indefinitely. Theory 4. A containment breach occurred during the final year, and the island was shut down to prevent public panic. None of these theories have been proven, but none of them have been disproven. And in the absence of answers, people create their own. Decades after the last patient left, the island remains sealed. Tours are forbidden. Access is restricted. Security still patrols at carefully timed intervals. There are no active structures, no functioning wards, no medical services. Yet the perimeter is protected as though the hospital never closed. Official justification? Safety concerns due to structural instability. Unofficially? No one agrees. Some believe dangerous materials remain inside. Others think the city wants to avoid lawsuits from those who once lived here. A smaller group believes the island contains answers. Someone prefers to keep sealed. The truth likely sits somewhere between the official story and the whispered ones. What's certain is simple. You are not allowed inside, and the island tells you that the moment you get close. The fences are tall. The warning signs are new. The patrols continue. Most abandoned hospitals fade from memory. This one stayed alive. This island, hidden in plain sight, tells a story the city prefers remains quiet. A story of patients forgotten, of records removed, of alarms that no one explains. There are abandoned places across America, but few carry this level of secrecy. Somewhere inside those locked rooms lies the truth. The real reason the island doesn't welcome visitors. Until it's open to the public, we may never know. If you want to see more investigations into America's forgotten places and darkest, subscribe to the channel. It helps us explore deeper, uncover more, and bring the untold stories to light.